let's start off with the big boys. And I believe that Syracuse will play 4 to 5 games against some of the elite teams in the country. And the reason why it's 4 or 5 is because I think we can all agree on at Tennessee is going to be super challenging. That might be the toughest game on the schedule. We went over them in the non-conference episode. Yesterday, we talked about how Duke and North Carolina, while those teams are at home, are still very, very challenging. And then the reason why it's either 4 or 5 is because in the Legends Classic, they're going to play at least one of Texas or Texas Tech. They might end up playing both. We don't know how the bracket is going to shape out, but they're going to play one of them, the other team being St. Joseph's. So it's a 4-team tournament in the Legends Classic. Syracuse will play at least Texas or Texas Tech, both of which are formidable opponents. At Tennessee is right now in the top 15. Duke and North Carolina in the top 15 as well. Texas Tech in the top 25, and Texas is on the border just outside the top 25. Honestly, they're pretty similar to Maryland, but I have Maryland more in the toss-up category. What are the keys for Syracuse in keeping up with these elite teams in the country? Well, first of all, it's to keep the rebounding margin respectable. I think Syracuse this offseason did a fantastic job improving the size on the team and getting more rebounding as a result. They brought in Eddie Lampkin from Colorado. He averaged 7 rebounds per game last year, and he's a pretty good offensive rebounder. If you look at his rate at which he offensive rebounds, he's actually better at offensive rebounding than defensive rebounding. You got to keep the rebounding margin close. Bringing in Eddie Lampkin is certainly going to help that. Jair Davis was an excellent rebounder for Delaware last season. He averaged between 7 and 8 rebounds per game, if I recall. Donnie Freeman was one of the best rebounders in high school last season. He was second in the EYBL league, only behind 5-star center recruit, who actually is going to Maryland, Derek Queen. So Syracuse brought in guys to help the rebounding. And the reason why this is important, I know Syracuse has never won in Chapel Hill. It's like the ghosts and everything like that. They just can't win there. The good news is they're not going to have to go to Chapel Hill this season. They get to play them at home. When Syracuse went to North Carolina last season, they lost by 36 points, and they lost the rebounding margin by 23. North Carolina already has more talent. They do. And this season, I project that they will have more talent this year as well. They should be better than Syracuse, just on paper alone. North Carolina getting 23 more rebounds than Syracuse. Think about how many second chance opportunities you are giving a team that is already considered better than you. That's not a winning formula. Now, when Syracuse ended up upsetting North Carolina, what happened? They didn't win the rebounding margin. They didn't win it. But Syracuse only lost it by 8. Still, you're giving North Carolina second chance opportunities, but if you can keep it to a relatively respectable margin, you can keep up with the big boys. If you only lose it by 8, I know that's second chances, but that allows someone on the team to get hot, which leads me to the second point in keeping up with the bad boy, or not the bad boys, that's the Pistons in the 80s. The big boys on Syracuse basketball schedule, you got to get a star performance. This sounds obvious, but let me explain it to you. Syracuse did a great job this offseason in getting depth. They did. They can legitimately run 8-9 deep. I believe that. You got Jaquan Carlos, J.J. Starling, Chris Bell, Eddie Lampkin, Donnie Freeman, Jair Davis, Jaquan Carlos, Elijah Moore, Lucas Taylor was just added. I'm probably missing a few names, but you get the idea. Syracuse has a deeper roster than they did last season. That's a good thing. But against some of these elite teams in the country, this is what can separate the elite teams from the middle of the pack teams, which is where Syracuse is. They don't just have star players. They don't just have the best players in the country. They also have depth. Okay? These teams have depth too. They can also run 8-9 deep. and those players are better than yours. So just because you can run deep, that does work to your advantage against some teams, and we'll talk about it later on in the podcast. But against the deep teams that these big boys have, the depth doesn't matter as much. You need star performances. And what do I mean by that? Chris Bell hitting 8 threes. He's done that before. That would be something that's helpful against some of these big boys. That's how you can keep up with them. J.J. Starling going for 30 points. That would certainly help. When Syracuse beat UNC last year, J.J. Starling and Judah Mintz combined for 48 points on 65% from the field. That is the recipe to success. You need star performances. You need just outlier games. You're going against the best teams in the country. It's not enough to just play 8 players and hope that it works out. You need your star players to really be stars. This is the time where you can't take a day off. That's the key. Those are the 2 keys. As far as what Syracuse needs to do, don't get blown out. You can't get blown out against these big boys. I understand they're really good. Tennessee out on the road, Duke, Carolina, Texas Tech. You can't get blown out in these games. Last year, against some of the best teams in the country, I said Tennessee, Gonzaga, at Duke, at UNC, Clemson, at Clemson, UNC at home. So it was 7 total games that I mentioned here. Syracuse was 1-6. They did have that win at home against UNC, but they lost the point differential by an average of nearly 16 points per game. That includes the fact that they actually won a game in there. You can't get blown out. It does not help your net. The net matters. I know it's a flawed system, but they take point differential into account. And you lose it by 16 points against these elite teams. That's not good enough. You can't do that. You're going to get blown out maybe, but try to keep it close and keep the final score relatively close. You can be between 7 and 8 points, maybe sneak out a win here or there. There you go. So overall, looking at this season, I say that if Syracuse can win 1 to 2 games and keep every other game relatively close, and that's once again at Tennessee, Texas/Texas Tech. They might end up playing both. Duke and North Carolina at home. If they can win 1 to 2 games and keep every other game close, that is perfectly respectable. It won't cost them too much. It'll give them a quad 1 win in all likelihood. It puts Syracuse in the conversation to make the tournament next season. I think their greatest opportunity next year, it's also probably their toughest game on the schedule, is at Tennessee, just because they're probably going to be a top 15 team, and the fact that it's a true road game. It's probably the toughest game on the schedule, so that's their best chance to really get a resume-building win. That's what I got with the big boys on Syracuse's schedule. The keys are rebounding. You got to keep the rebounding margin relatively close, and you need your star players to have excellent games, or else you're really not going to win. Those are the keys. Just don't get blown out. Maybe you can sneak out a win or 2, and Syracuse can get back in the conversation for the NCAA tournament. Now, coming up, we'll talk about the toss-up games on Syracuse's schedule and how it's a little bit different than handling the big boys.